on important issues like toxics, because there are 16,000 different chemicals used to make plastics. We do about 4 webinars a year. We're not a webinar shop. It's not like we're like set up to just crank out lots of webinars and we pick the topic years in advance. We purposely wait to see what the important issues of the day are. And once I read Sharon Lerner's article in the New Yorker and in ProPublica about PFAS and the pioneering work of Dr. Kris Hansen, I knew we had to do a webinar on this topic. And we're so grateful for Sharon and Kris for being so generous with our time. At first, we were just going to have Sharon. And then one of our Beyond Plastics supporters, Susan Abrams, emailed us and said, maybe you could get Kris Hansen to join. And Susan's daughter or someone she knows you, Kris. And I thought this was a great idea. And then Sharon said, well, I know how to reach Kris. We'll get her on. So the point of that story is send us your good ideas. If they are good ideas, we will follow up with them. If they're not really good ideas, we'll just say that's an idea and move on. So having Kris and Sharon together was an amazing suggestion. This is an educational event. It's free and open to the public. If you are on social media, I urge you to live tweet and post about this as the evening is unfolding. And you can tag us. Our tag is at Beyond Plastics. Sharon Lerner's tag is at Fast Lerner, FASTLERNER, and also tag ProPublica, PROPUBLICA. The chat is turned off for now, but when we get to the point of questions and answers, we will turn it back on. And I urge you to keep your questions short because then we're more likely to select it. I want to thank my Beyond Plastics colleagues, Eve Fox, and also Andrew Craigie and Dr. Megan Wolf for helping to pull this together. So let me introduce our 2 wonderful speakers. We're just going to have a conversation tonight and try to cover as much ground as we can and leave time for all of you. Sharon Lerner is a leading journalist. She covers health and the environment for the national media outlet ProPublica, which I strongly urge you to subscribe to. It's my first read in the morning very often. Before ProPublica, Sharon was an investigative reporter at the publication The Intercept, where she focused on failures of environmental regulatory processes, as well as biosafety and COVID. Sharon has reported extensively on PFAS, which is a family of chemicals linked to cancer, infertility, developmental harm, and immune dysfunction. She details how the manufacturers of the chemicals have covered up the dangers of this family of chemicals for decades. Sharon also broke the news that firefighting foam, you've seen that white foam used when there's very high temperature fires at like airports. Sharon broke the news that firefighting foam used by the military contained PFAS, and that Gen N, Gen X, a PFAS compound that DuPont created to replace the cancer-causing compound PFOS, which also caused cancer. Sharon's work has been honored by the Society of Environmental Journalists 11 times and by the Newswomen's Club of New York, which named her Journalist of the Year in 2021. Let me introduce Dr. Kris Hansen. Following her undergraduate chemistry degree at Williams College, Dr. Hansen earned a PhD in chemistry from the University of Colorado Boulder. At both colleges, she focused on analyzing and tracking low levels of chemicals in the environment. She started at 3M in 1996 as an analytical chemist in 3M'S environmental lab. This is important, remember that. Between 1997 and 2001, she led the discovery and tracking of 3M'S PFAS compounds through the environment including in the blood of people worldwide. She worked independently as part of a team to develop sensitive and specific analytical methods for PFAS in samples as varied as river water, human blood, polar bear livers, bird eggs, and milk curd from rodents. Yum. At the suggestion of her boss, Kris left the 3M environmental lab in 2001 and worked in other parts of 3M's businesses until 2022. She is currently a consultant for Savannah Science in Minnesota. She lives in Minnesota, and I added to your bio, Kris, that you volunteer at a local nature preserve where you clear paths and protect native plants. Thank you for doing that too. This is the first time that Dr. Kris Hansen and journalist Sharon Lerner are publicly appearing together, and we're honored to have them. So thank you for joining. My first question is for Dr. Hansen. You are a chemist. Please give us, the audience, a very basic chemistry lesson right now. PFAS chemicals are a family of chemicals that have been they've become known as forever chemicals. What are they, and why are they called forever chemicals? And then I'll ask you a few more questions.
Great. Thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you for having me here. So PFAS stands for per or polyfluorinated alkyl substances, and it is an entire class of compounds. The thing that makes them forever chemicals is the carbon-fluorine bond, which essentially doesn't exist in nature. It takes a lot of energy to make that bond, and it takes a lot of energy to break that bond. So when these chemicals are manufactured within the chemical industry, they're creating something that really hasn't ever been made before and does not break down in the environment by the normal mechanisms that chemicals break down in hydrolysis or photolysis. They're very useful chemicals because they are so stable. So they have been used extensively in products as varied as fry pans and raincoats. I think we've all heard about that. But they're also, because of their chemical properties, they're often used as processing aids in making all sorts of things that you wouldn't ever consider that you would need a forever chemical for. Bandages, tampons, anything like that, toilet paper. And so these compounds are manufactured, they're used extensively, and they enter the environment. They enter from the manufacturing facilities up the smokestacks and out into the waterways. And they enter when we use the products as consumers. They enter into our bodies, they enter into our wastewater. Of course, they're called forever chemicals because they don't degrade, but we could also call them everywhere chemicals because we now know they are everywhere, all around the earth because of their durability.
And even with everything we know today about this family of chemicals, of forever chemicals, today they're still being used. Tell me if I'm wrong. In non-stick pots and pans, is that right? Still being used in dental floss, guitar strings, hand sanitizer. Tell me if I'm getting anything wrong.
Nope, I haven't heard anything yet.
Ski wax.
I think they're moving away from ski wax because the ski community has kind of said we're done with those. So maybe you can check ski wax off the list.
Good. Because a lot of time the wax is applied indoors.
Yeah, it's true.
So what about fishing lines?
I guess I'm not, I have heard that. I don't think I could be an expert on everything that they're produced with, but you know, it's a huge family of chemicals with 10,000 members. And so they're used in probably 10 times as many applications as there are chemicals.
Okay, PFAS jeopardy is over. I just find it astonishing that with the abundance of peer-reviewed science, we still have companies selling, pots and pans and dental floss with PFAS in it. Sharon, so what are the companies? Let's name names. What are the companies that are the big producers of PFAS? And And audience, remember that there's a large universe of consumer brand companies that use PFAS, but then a smaller universe that actually manufactures the PFAS. 3M happens to play both roles. Is that right, Sharon?
Yes, it did. That is coming to an end, and thank you for having me and for the introduction. There are a handful, I guess about 10 or 12 companies that still make PFAS, that make the majority of them. They include Honeywell, BASF, Bayer, Chemours, which is a spinoff from DuPont, Daikin, Solvay, and of course 3M, which we're talking about today. I think you're muted.
I think I've done this a couple times. So Sharon, just to continue on the previous line of questioning, I just want to hear from you. How is it that these chemicals are still being manufactured today? And the ingredients are in so many products that our children come in direct contact with.
Well, I guess the short answer of why they're still available and being used is because nobody has stopped them. So it's a profitable thing to do for these companies, or they wouldn't continue to do them. And the EPA has not banned them in the, people think, oh, why don't you just ban them? It's not that simple, and they have not done that. There was a voluntary agreement in 2006 to phase out PFOS and other related chemicals that had 8 carbons, like PFOS. 3M actually phased out PFOS, or made the announcement in 2000. And other companies followed in 2006 as part of this voluntary agreement, but voluntary. So there, and as Kris mentioned, there are thousands in the class, and these other companies that we just mentioned are continuing to make those other chemicals, and the EPA is actually continuing to approve a handful of new ones as well.
Yeah, that's something. So full disclosure, I used to work at the EPA. I was appointed by President Obama to serve as the Region 2 Regional Administrator, and worked a lot on PFOA in drinking water. We had a situation in Hoosick Falls in upstate New York that's been pretty well documented. And no one will believe me when I say this, but compared to other chemicals, things are moving quickly on the PFAS. My former colleagues are wonderful and they're thorough, but not known for speed. So here things are moving along, and we'll talk a little bit later about what EPA is and isn't doing. So let's talk about this great story, because when I was in the first page of the story, I wanted to know how you two connected. So Sharon, Dr. Hansen calls you on the telephone, and you travel to Minnesota to meet with her. So take us through the story from there, how you told this story about her work.
Well, okay, I'll fact check you a little bit, because actually the first thing that happened was that Kris emailed me and I emailed her back. And then we did have dozens of conversations, I believe, before I went out there. Is that right, Kris? I think many conversations. Yes, at least. I am pretty sure we had hundreds. I hope it wasn't thousands, but God, it might have been communications. So we were in close touch on the phone. She was very gracious. She obviously reached out to me, so it wasn't one of those situations where I had to press her hard to, allow me to come visit. She was very welcoming, and I went out there in February of 2023, I believe. And then we continued speaking on the phone, and you were asking me about what she told me, right? So I had written before about PFAS before, and which is part of why she reached out to me. She was reaching out because someone had sent her a link to a John Oliver segment about PFAS. And basically he had, raised the alarm and said these, I believe he said that, the world is covered in devil's piss, is what he said. And one of her former professors had sent her that link and said, is this accurate? And I'm paraphrasing her here. And basically, Kris thought at the time, that was 2021, that it was not accurate. She didn't know about all those health effects. And that launched for her. And Kris, please at any point jump in here, because now I'm telling your story while you are actually here, which is a little weird. But that launched for her a period of investigation and sort of going back over to these chemicals that she had not worked with for about 20 years. And in that process, I think she was directed by a scientist to me, because I think once she started getting, becoming aware of what had been going on at 3M, both while she was there and way before she was there, she started getting upset, I think. Is that fair, Kris?
Fair, yes.
And wanted to tell her story. And someone said to her, you know what, instead of like trying to tell your story, maybe have this person tell your story. And I'm grateful to that person. It was Arlene Blum, who connected us. And then, but basically, in short, and I'm sure we'll get to more of this, what she was telling me was that she was given an assignment in she was working as a chemist in the environmental lab. She was in her late 20s. It was the late 1990s. And basically 3M had recently switched from doing the analysis of its workers' blood in-house to hiring an outside lab. And the reason they analyzed their blood was because they knew they worked closely with this chemical, PFOS, and that they had the chemical in their blood. So when the outside lab starts trying to take it over for comparison purposes, they use a blank, which is a sample that's not supposed to contain PFOS. It's blood, but it's not from a worker who works at the company. So this outside lab, when it does this, finds that there's a contaminant in the supposedly clean blood. And Kris's boss asked her to figure out what's going on. Kris, do you want to just take over this part? Because I feel like weird. I'm now telling your story and you are here.
Yeah, but you're doing such a great job. So,
all right. Well, I'm pretty familiar with this part of the story, I'll say. So just in short, she starts doing this work and she realizes not just that the samples that the lab had been looking at have a contaminant, and in fact that contaminant is PFOS, but she begins looking at samples of blood from blood banks around the country and realizes that actually every sample has PFOS in it. And she begins looking at animals and every sample has PFOS in it. And so she has right there made a pretty startling discovery, which is that this chemical made by her employer is everywhere. It's in blood everywhere. And she takes this finding to her boss. And I think initially thought, wow, I've discovered something really important. And now this will quickly change the course of how the company behaves. And it turned out that was not the case. And in fact, she got a lot of pushback and a lot of criticism. She was challenged and somewhat ostracized, I think, if that's fair. And Kris, I do feel like you should just take it over from here. But basically, she was the term that we used in one of the headlines was gaslit. But Kris, you go from here.
But before we continue, Dr. Hansen, you were sounding the alarm inside 3M, and you were, as Sharon described, you were largely ignored, marginalized, and sidelined. So I want to keep going with the through line, but I also want to ask this question about roles and responsibilities that we have as individuals in society, in businesses, in government. When you worked at 3M, you were not in a union, is that right?
no.
So, and you were not supported by your supervisors. You really did try to raise these issues to people on the highest levels of the company, including what sounded like, according to Sharon's reporting, a very difficult meeting with the CEO of 3M, where you were pretty much interrogated rather than them listening to the important information that you discovered and you were presenting to them. So what advice do you have for other scientists inside companies that may be having similar experiences, maybe not on this large scale, but they're trying to bring science to the business leaders? How do you navigate a corporate culture that is not serious about protecting public health?
That's a great question. And one could say that I failed, that the method that I tried, which was to collect as much data as I could, to document it as carefully as I could, and to raise it as high as I could, was only marginally effective. And, you know, I wonder, I think that sometimes we believe that there's this, this easy solution that I've had people say, well, why didn't you go to the local newspaper? And I tried to imagine going to the newspaper in Minneapolis as a 28-year-old mid-level scientist in the Twin Cities' largest employer, and imagine how it would be if I called them up and said, hey, 3M is not making good decisions here. Or if I had called the EPA and said, hey, 3M is not making good decisions here. I don't think it's maybe as easy as some people think it is to, put on your cape and be a superhero.
You know, I might just add in right here that we don't even have to imagine, because there was such a whistleblower, not exactly at 3M, but there was someone who was working in the Minnesota state government in the Pollution Control Agency who actually did a report on PFAS pollution from 3M sites, and was extensive, and she was very much raising the alarm, and she was in fact fired. Her name is Fardin Ollier. I'm probably mispronouncing that. I've written about her before, but she lost her job. The director of that agency was a former 3M executive, and she was summarily fired. She lost so much. She not only lost her job, she lost her house. She never ended up working in as a scientist again, and it was a devastating experience for her, I think. It's fair to say. So I think that there are real costs to real whistleblowing. I think the work that Fardeen did ended up being prescient and useful, but she paid a very high cost.
Yeah, wow, I didn't realize that. So if anyone is listening and you work for a government agency and you are a whistleblower and not getting the action that you think is needed to protect public health, I want to refer you to a national organization called PEER, Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. There's no PEER for 3M employees or DuPont employees, but if you work at a government office, a government agency, PEER is an excellent resource for whistleblowers. And I personally think whistleblowing is very patriotic and is not always, but almost always done to protect public health in some setting. Sharon, a lot of what you write about in general, and is a major focus of the article here, is the corporate culture of secrecy. So, I asked Kris about advice for other scientists in her situation, but it's very much linked to the corporate culture of secrecy. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, this piece for me was as much about the secret that was at the heart of it, which was, that PFOS was in the blood of everyone, was toxic, and the company had known it. It was as much about that as it was about how the company kept that secret. So when I was at The Intercept, I had written about 3M, and court documents had shown, I think they were released in 2018, there were court documents that showed that there were some people at 3M, one scientist in particular, who had confirmed that that basically a chemical that was present in the blood of blood banks was PFOS. And so The headline of that article was 3M knew. And it really, went into depth. But for me, for a while anyway, it was sort of that simple. 3M knew, the company knew, and I wasn't wrong that some at the company did have that knowledge. But before talking to Kris, like it hadn't quite occurred to me that not everybody at the company knew, because then of course the public would have known. It was really a small handful of
Yeah,
people.
right.
And so the question for me became, who knew? And like, what did they know? And most importantly, how did they keep it all secret? And talking to Kris, I think there are a lot of answers to that. Some of it has to do with the culture, right? And that, a culture of not sharing information if you don't absolutely have to. But also I think it has to do with the individuals who keep the secret, right? And who are silent for really this incredible number of reasons. And this piece is very much about Kris and kind of her own reasons for sort of not dealing with this before and dealing with it when she did. I think, is that fair, Kris? Like there is a period where you were not thinking about this. And I tried to kind of think about that in terms of a very understandable approach to this really kind of messed up situation she is in. I mean, not very many people, I think, would respond as Fardine Ollier did, right? Because it's really perilous to do that. So anyway, there are personal reasons, and a lot of it was about Kris, but it was also about some of the other people that she worked with who I began to learn about as I did more reporting.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's almost overwhelming to think about what 3M and other producers of PFAS chemicals knew when they knew it and kept it quiet, and all of the health damage that happened after that.
Well, that is sort of why I came back to this subject, because I would say, I mean, first, of course, Kris had a really interesting story to tell, but I had, even after reporting on it for years, had remained really sort of stuck on this idea that, when the first discovery happened, really, that the realization that PFOS was in the blood of everyone, that was 1975, so almost 50 years ago. And I've always thought, well, this could have gone a very different way. And it's one thing to think that, but then and I did think that, and then but this piece was sort of a little bit trying to understand why it didn't, obviously with the hope that like it can, thinking about this kind of thing will help us not do it again.
Yeah,
I think
and I'm sure. Go ahead, Kris. Sorry.
I just want to point out the universal lessons. I think that, I mean, PFAS is the topic of what we're talking about today, but PFAS is not unique. 3M is not unique.
Yes.
There is, essentially a playbook that companies follow to intimidate, quiet, sideline, move, silo people like me. And there is specific practices that they employ, not doing the experiments that need to be done because they don't want to deal with data. Reporting only or sharing only data that supports the bottom line and burying data that doesn't. And so personally, what I thought was so brilliant about Sharon's article is that it used PFAS and 3M as the heart of its narrative, but it really can be applied very widely. And I read it as a warning and a lesson to us as both consumers, but also just as people who live on this planet, that, we need to be aware that what happened at 3M is not unique. And we need to be thinking about how we as individuals and how we can work with our elected leaders to stop this from happening again and again and again.
Right. And the three of us are not politically naive. We know that companies act like this because they're worried about liability, they're worried about lawsuits, and even something like Superfund cleanups, which I worked on when I was at EPA. Companies, most of them, just slow walk the process, because like that's another quarter that they don't have to pay for remediation. And we need strong regulatory agencies to protect public health. Driving this home, at least 40% of US tap water contains one or more forever chemicals. And Sharon, an expert, told you that the cost of removing them all would likely reach at least $100 billion. There are ways to remove some chemicals from drinking water. The most common technology is carbon filtration, but then that spent carbon has to go somewhere. And then something called reverse osmosis that is effective. But a big concern that I have is, first and foremost, you have to protect public health. If you know that there are high levels of any chemical in a drinking water source, you have to act quickly, get treatment technologies installed. But what I'm witnessing lately, as a resident of New York State, is some agencies are saying, and I quote, PFAS is everywhere. And if it's showing up in private wells, we just come in, we slap on a carbon filtration system, we kind of look for the source, but we move on. And that is a problem, because one of the fundamental principles of environmental law is you look for the source of pollution and you work to remediate it. You don't just slap on carbon filters and call it a day. And also, these compounds are virtually indestructible in the environment. Many of the second generation of the PFAS compounds, which have also been linked to health effects, may not be effectively treated with carbon filtration. And it's not just people. It's, we're contaminating groundwater, which fish and wildlife depend on, agriculture depends on. It's not just all about what comes out of the tap. So Kris, can you talk a little bit about your own community in Minnesota? You learned that there was a $750 million allocation for PFAS cleanup to drinking water, serving 150,000 people. So looking at the earlier metric, do you think 100 billion for 48% of people drinking water in the US is an underestimate?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's a huge underestimate. In my community, as you said, 150,000 people. I think the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has done an amazing job, both characterizing the fluorochemical pollution and contamination in my community, which has a lot of very obvious point sources, as well as some that are a little bit harder to identify, and to come up with a strategy to use that 750 million to provide clean drinking water for the whole community. And that was a result of litigation that was settled between 3M and the state of Minnesota. And we are now a few years out from that litigation being settled, and it's really dawning on everybody here that 750 million was not enough. And in Minnesota, there are communities just south of the region that was included in the lawsuit, communities that just learned that all of the drinking water that they have is contaminated. And they're wondering, how are we going to fix this and who is going to pay for it? So if it took almost $1 billion to fix the groundwater in my community of 150,000, you can do the math, but 100 billion is not going to get us there.
Yeah, I think that is so important. We've got to be realistic about the costs, and it really makes the case for preventing this pollution rather than cleaning it up, not to mention the human suffering and the economic cost of people who get sick from this. I want to mention two things that the EPA have done recently that give us a little bit of hope, and then go to questions. Andrew, you can open up the chat. Folks can start typing questions. So this is not hopeless. People across the country are taking action. They're protecting their communities. Earlier this year, in April, US EPA did two key things. First, it announced that PFOS and PFOA are likely to cause cancer and that, that's not good news, but they said it, and that no level of either chemical is considered safe. It deemed them hazardous substances under the Superfund law. So that will unleash the Superfund process. EPA also set limits for 6 PFAS chemicals in drinking water. And then some states are taking action. Washington State, Minnesota, Maine. In New York, we haven't passed it yet, but Beyond Plastics and others are working on a packaging reduction bill that would require a reduction in plastic packaging and ban 18 chemicals from packaging, including the entire PFAS family. So I think, progress is slow, but things are definitely moving in the right direction. A question from one of our viewers: do blood collection efforts test for the presence of PFAS?
They do not.
Okay.
Yep, at this time.
Yep, they do not. Do products labeled Gore-Tex contain PFAS?
That's a sticky question. Sharon, maybe you know.
I know historically they have. I think that they recently introduced a new line of products that are PFAS free, but I think that they're continuing to use PFAS in other products. And I would recommend people Googling that because, that's, I've been paying great attention to that. So that is what I think.
And it would have been a relatively recent change if they are.
Yeah, I know that they did introduce a new PFAS-free product, but I believe that they haven't abandoned all the use of the chemicals altogether.
So another question is, are the major sources of PFAS found at chemical plant locations? And what was the source at Hoosick Falls? So again, it's found where the chemicals are being manufactured, but more often found at places that use products that contain PFAS. So for Hoosick Falls, New York, right on the Vermont border, it was a French company called Saint-Gobain, and they used PFAS in some of their products, and their facility was very, very close to the public water supply. And that's how the PFOA got into the public water supply. And sadly, the company knew this. The state health department in New York knew this for 18 months before telling the public that they were drinking contaminated water. And it was EPA that came in and alerted the public to not drink that water.
I would add another hot spot that's kind of easy to identify besides chemical manufacturers is military bases and airports. A lot of places that may use the firefighting foam, it's called AFFF or light water. They'll use it for training exercises, and so that chemical, which is PFOS, PFHXS, PFOA, has been going into the groundwater for decades at those sites.
We're being asked, are certain products more likely to leach PFAS into the environment than others?
Absolutely, from my perspective as a chemist. So, for example, when fluorochemicals are used to coat paper or cardboard for grease resistance, if the food is microwaved, for example, you have a hot, wet environment inside that microwave popcorn bag, for example, and that makes a really easy way for fluorochemicals to come out of that paper and go directly into the product. If you have a raincoat that has fluorochemicals on it, the amount of fluorochemical that is going to go into your skin through that raincoat is probably pretty minimal. But when you put that raincoat in the washing machine, a lot of the fluorochemical comes off and it goes down the drain and probably recirculates back into your home in the form of drinking water.
And a helpful tip from Beyond Plastics this evening is never eat microwavable popcorn, because
I agree with that.
Yeah, right? Because sometimes the inside lining of the bags have PFOA as a grease resistant. That was a very sad thing for me to learn many years ago. No more.
Yeah, my children never forgave me for that.
Yes,
I
but you were
forbid them.
protecting them, Kris.
Right.
There have also been studies that people who eat a lot of fast food have high levels of PFAS in their blood because it's in the fast food packaging. So it's a grease resistant. From Rebecca Martin, state and federal permits allow a certain amount of chemicals to be released into the environment. Cumulatively, it's a real problem. So why are our agencies meant to protect public health allowing any amount of poisonous chemicals into the environment?
Why indeed? I don't really have a better answer to that.
It's almost a rhetorical
A very
question.
good point.
Yeah,
Very
money,
good point.
probably. If we dug deep enough, there would be money.
So another question, I understand that blood tests don't exist for each type of PFAS. Is it feasible to create thousands of unique tests? If not, will PFAS remain invisible in many cases? And Sharon, isn't it true that most is PFOA and PFOS? So if you're testing for that, you're getting an indicator.
In terms of blood levels, I actually think that has changed, and because the level of of both those chemicals has been decreasing, and it depends on the community that you're in and what the source of contamination was. But I know for a lot of the communities that are near military bases and airports is PFHXS. So it depends on on where you are. And as those go down, others are going up, and actually in the tap water study that you mentioned, I believe that the compound that was found most often was actually PFBS, which is a 4-carbon compound that 3M swapped in to replace PFOS.
Just speaking as an analytical chemist, I can say that if you can identify the fluorochemical, the analytical chemist can find it and develop a test for it. What makes it challenging is that sometimes the corporations don't even know what fluorochemicals are in their products. And so, it's hard to identify something if you don't know what it is. But the analytical capabilities now exist that if a fluorochemical is identified, it can be tested for. It's not practical at some level because there are so many different compounds. And so there's also methods now that will test for total organic fluorine. It'll just say your total PFAS level is this. And then maybe you also can test for a few of the really bad players like PFOA and PFOS.
Got it. So here's a question from Erica. I am a legislator struggling to help my communities with PFAS contamination in a small, privately owned public water system, but who cannot afford to do the needed mitigation work. How can I be effective in moving the bar? None of this is large-scale manufacturing contamination, simply areas relying on septic or wastewater.
That's a great question. I mean, I think that with the EPA's regulations now, that water supplier will be required by 2025, I think, to test the water, communicate the results. And I think they have until 2029. Please correct me if I'm wrong by a year.
I think the full span was 5 years. It's like there's a 3-year mark and a 5-year mark. And I think it started in 2024. Yeah, so that's right.
2029. Yeah, so the value of what EPA passed with that regulation is that the water suppliers will be required to find a solution by 2029. And unfortunately, for small communities, and this is what just kills me, small communities, it is going to be an expensive fix. Right. And that is going to end up on the shoulders of the people who are paying for their water. And so that's why I think there has to be some accountability from these corporations who profited to the tune of $1 billion a year, when a small community like that one is going to have to pay for a $500 million filtration system.
And let me, just one of the questions that I just saw flash by was asking about litigation and and the source of documents. And one of the sources of documents that was the Minnesota Attorney General's suit, and those documents can be found online. But a second source that was really important is the litigation that's going on now against 3M, or recently settled. Part of it was recently settled. The part about water purveyors, and basically they settled with water utilities, with 3M agreeing to pay up to $12.5 billion to help communities get PFAS out of their water, which I think we all now know is really not close to enough.
Right, right. And back to Erica, the legislator's question, every state gets money from EPA for safe drinking water. And so you should contact your state environmental agency. They have something called the State Revolving Loan Fund, or they just deposit the money at the state agency, and there might be some state funding to assist with that local situation, depending on your state. And they're going to make sure that you have to exhaust all legal remedies to make sure that the water supplier cannot afford to pay. And of course, you don't want them disappearing, because then you don't have your private water supply. Question is, what practices have you implemented in your daily lives to limit exposure to PFAS if possible?
Go ahead,
Sharon?
Sharon.
Well, I'm, and I'm not just saying this because you're here, Judith, but I am a big, I try my best not to use single-use plastics. I don't know that, I saw another question in the chat, does every plastic contain PFAS? I don't know the answer to that. I think the answer is no. But they contain lots of contaminants, and it's such a big source that is unnecessary, right? So that's one thing I'm doing. And another thing I'm doing, the easy, no popcorn, no nonstick pans, that kind of stuff is easy. But I've also somewhat made peace with the fact that they really are everywhere. Both 3M and I believe Chemours told me that PFAS are in every car and cell phone. It's when you think about, like, there are, so thousands of products, but when you think about every car and cell phone, it really gives you the sort of the spread of them. So, I do still use cars and cell phones, but so it's a matter of like choosing your battles.
And
Kris, you want to
for
go?
me, less about what I do in my personal life, just because I think I've been thinking about this longer than most people, just because I've been exposed. But for me, it's educating others. Honestly, we are all connected in this. And the only way that we can really, truly minimize exposure to these compounds is to turn off the tap, right? To get laws passed that make it illegal to dump these chemicals in the environment through products or through manufacturing. And so that's kind of how I'm day-to-day focusing my efforts.
Yeah, systemic change, because plastic is everywhere. So we need to pass strong laws to reduce plastics. PFAS chemicals are everywhere. It's in all our blood. We've got to address this. Little tip is never ever put plastic in the microwave.
Yeah.
That'll help a tiny bit.
And voice your preferences whenever possible to whatever companies that you're interacting with. Like, it's fine and good to ask what is in the product if you can ever, get to the people who make those, who you can actually communicate with.
Mm-hmm. Do products that contain PFAS have the chemicals listed on the product or on the product label?
Some do and some don't. I think it's, that there are some products where you can find some perfluoral prefix to alert you to the fact that there's PFAS compounds in a product. But I was talking to someone from another country who says that there's a lot of farms, a lot of home farms that have chickens and they sell their eggs. Well, their eggs have PFAS in them, right? Because the chickens are being exposed to PFAS. And so it's like, I think that there are both things like the food that we eat and some of the products that we interact with, that the people who make the products don't even know that they have PFAS in them. And that's not an excuse for them, but it is, I would not say that the label is the only place. If it's not on the label, you shouldn't assume that it's PFAS free.
Mhm.
Like
Got it.
bottled water.
It's a great one.
So let's talk about the Supreme Court, everyone. One question deals with a case called Chevron. And just to explain it, for 40 years, the federal courts have said that federal agencies like the EPA, the FDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, that when there is litigation, you defer to those federal agencies for their expertise and their science. And very recently, the Supreme Court ruled that those agencies no longer have deference. It's known as, the case is Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, so it's called the Chevron case. So the question is, given the nullification of the Chevron deference, will this make it difficult or impossible to pass laws limiting PFAS? And I want to revise the question. I don't know if it necessarily will make it harder to pass the laws, but will it make it harder for EPA to issue comprehensive regulations to enforce those laws? One of you want to take that?
Sharon can take it.
Yeah, well, to enforce them, yes. And to be, clear, we don't know what will happen. This decision just came down. So, but experts do anticipate that it will be easier for companies and industry, which, often challenge EPA as it is, to win in court, and to have, it basically is going to be that it depends on what judge that these cases end up with, but we're going to have these decisions made in courts instead of by the scientists and experts who have trained to weigh in on these things and interpret these really, really complicated policies. And they've been doing this for years. So it is, I think, overall, a very worrisome decision for the environment. And, I've heard also some people say that it will make it easier for environmental groups to challenge some, to get their positions across in court. But I think overarchingly, this is probably will be a bad decision for people who are concerned about clean water and clean air. And it was brought by Chevron, it was brought by a company that was hoping to challenge restrictions on it. So yeah, it's an unfortunate decision.
So let's shift to a really hot issue, an important issue in many communities, and that's plastic turf or synthetic turf, which many school districts and parks are actually installing so they don't have to maintain grass. There are now 8 states that have passed legislation regarding synthetic turf, all of which contains PFAS. Most of the laws, however, use this unfortunate language, which I am seeing pop up more and more in a bunch of different environmental laws, intentionally added PFAS, knowing that conceivably millions of acres of plastic turf that cover parks and schools and homes will be weakened because of that legislation, and industry saying that their products don't contain intentionally added PFAS. Sharon, you want to comment on that?
I have written about this, and it, the turf issue, certainly it contains PFAS, and you think about it, it rains, there are all these different ways that it can leach out of the turf into the water and land and soil around it. What I hadn't really considered before I looked into this and started writing about it was that then you have these vast areas that are covered with turf, and then eventually in some number of years it wears thin, you got to get rid of it. And so there's no actual good way to dispose of it. And these giant rolls are like being kind of stuck in the woods and, you know, where they continue to leach. So I think it's a real problem. And I hadn't been aware of the language added to the laws, but I see your point there. And yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say except that it's definitely a problem.
So we have more questions than we have time. I'm going to wrap us up. A couple quick things. One is you will get a recording of this from Beyond Plastics tomorrow. Please share the recording with your elected officials, with people you know who are interested in this. Lots of really talented people around the country working on this issue at the local level, and so that education will climb up the ladder of government. Lots of good information on the Beyond Plastics website. Also, you'll get this article, Kris's blogs, other follow-up information, and I urge you to become active on the PFAS issue. It's an issue in virtually every community in the country. And then a shameless plug, I teach an online class every semester on plastic pollution that's open to community people around the country. You can audit it. You can join Bennington College undergrads on Zoom Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock, starting right after Labor Day. It's a 7-week class. Register on our website because it's a really good way to learn the nuts and bolts of the plastics issue. Sharon and Kris, any final thoughts?
Thank you for your interest in bringing us together. I've enjoyed catching up with Sharon. I miss all of her phone calls.
A long time. Yeah, no, thanks for having us.
Let's do it tomorrow night. We could just keep talking about PFAS. And everyone subscribe to ProPublica. It's one of the best media outlets in the country right now during quite a perilous time.
ProPublica.org. Yeah.
ProPublica.org. Lisa Song, a reporter with ProPublica, just did an amazing piece just a few weeks ago on serious problems with so-called chemical recycling, something that Beyond Plastics strongly opposes as a solution to the plastics crisis. And they also cover non-environmental stuff in a really interesting way. So thanks for joining us tonight. We will see you on future webinars, and take good care, everyone.